Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We are very happy to have Dr. Cassandra Thiel with us, who is the assistant professor at New York University in the Grossman School of Medicine's Departments of Population Health, Ophthalmology, and the Tandon School of Engineering's Department of Civil and Urban Engineering. She's also the president and CEO of Clinically Sustainable Consulting, LLC. She will present for us today. Welcome, Cassie, and or Dr. Thiel, I should say. And she will run through her presentation, and our Director of Research, Nathan Ayer, will answer your questions for you at the end. So please take it away, Cassie.
Thank you very much, Holly. And Cassie's fine. You don't have to worry about Dr. Thiel. So welcome, everyone. It's great to see some names I recognize and many names I do not. It's awesome to have you here. So some of you may know this, well, you probably know it just from the announcement about this program, but I work pretty much exclusively in the healthcare space when it comes to sustainability. And that focus has been really interesting. So I'm hoping today to share some of the things that are going on in the healthcare space and some of the ways that I think we as LCA practitioners or users could kind of help grow the LCA space with lessons from the healthcare industry. So this is the other slide I have for all of this. When presenting for medical audiences, I always have to have disclosures, and I do own a consulting business, and so through that, I work with many different medical device manufacturers and other groups. So this is just to say that some of these things are, of course, influenced by all the things I've been learning in these different groups, but none of the things I have to say are meant to support or criticize a particular company, product, or system. I just really want to make things more sustainable. So we all know climate change is changing everything. And, though the pandemic was a little bit different, healthcare systems are facing a lot of issues off the heels of the pandemic. And there are still lots of health system closures and supply chain disruptions as a result of climate events. So just as an example, Hurricane Maria, of course, a few years ago now, hit Puerto Rico, which is a major manufacturing site for a lot of pharmaceuticals. And for the island itself, this meant that electrical systems crashed, backup generators were damaged, and things like MRI machines, some of them had quenched and were unavailable for use, in addition to just having staffing shortages. So the ability to care for the patients on the island who desperately needed medical care at this time was substantially impacted. And not just that, but this led to shortages of supplies that we utilize all the time in the healthcare space. This is just one example for IV fluid bags. You can imagine these fluid bags are things that are used all the time in healthcare. And we just didn't have them for a long time because the major manufacturing site was disrupted. And I have heard recently that there are still some pharmaceuticals that are very difficult to obtain because they were manufactured in Puerto Rico. And since 2017, 2018, we still haven't really rebounded the manufacturing at these sites. So climate change is causing a lot of issues. But what a lot of people don't know, particularly even if they're in the healthcare space, is that healthcare itself has a pretty large footprint when it comes to greenhouse gases and other environmental emissions as well. Globally, healthcare is responsible for about 5% of our carbon footprint, and that's actually more than the aviation industry. In the US, of course, we're better. And by that, I mean worse. All right, I'll go back. The US healthcare system generates about 8.5% of the US's emissions. So basically, if you pulled US healthcare out of the US and made it its own country, it'd be the 13th largest emitter in the world. So this is an industry that has a directive to care for people, but also has a really large footprint and adverse impact. Getting away from carbon emissions, it's not just about carbon. This is one specific example, again, from a few years ago, where pretty much all single-use disposable medical supplies that are used in operating rooms around the country and around the world are sterilized using ethylene oxide, which is very toxic. That's why we're using it. And unfortunately, in the places where ethylene oxide is being used, they're finding higher levels of cancer. And so this is just one example of a sterigenics facility north of Chicago where the EPA identified higher rates of cancer in this region, probably pointing back to this ethylene oxide emissions. And the company was within their EPA limits for these emissions, so it wasn't like they were doing anything illegal or off code. But as a result of the community outcry over this plant was closed. There have been no changes to how we sterilize single-use products. So this is a classic NIMBY or not in my backyard example, where these emissions then got moved elsewhere. And this is still ongoing today. I think a lot of medical device manufacturers are aware of this issue and are trying to come up with alternative solutions for the moment in time when they'll probably be forced to change. And it's not just about environmental issues. There are labor issues all throughout these supply chains, as there are with most supply chains. The National Health Services in England had a really cool surgeon who happened to come from Pakistan originally. And when he was back visiting, his uncle, I think, took him to a factory where his surgical tools were manufactured, and he saw child labor there. And there are certainly all other kinds of labor violations and ethical concerns in the supply chains for healthcare. So a lot of issues. And life cycle assessment, of course, is a great tool to be able to delve into some of these issues, not all of them. And we've been increasingly using life cycle assessment in the healthcare space to better understand what kinds of things we can do. So there's been high-level life cycle assessments using IO or input-output models, the financial models, and that's where we get the national level statistics or the global statistics. And in my line of work, we've been using process-based LCA as much as possible. We can't use it for everything, but process-based LCA on like procedures or clinical care, a little more of a subset of health systems to figure out what kinds of things could be done to improve the environmental footprint of healthcare services. So what kinds of questions are we answering with LCA in this healthcare space? There's been a big uptick in the use of LCA in healthcare lately. There's a great website, healthcarelca.org, I believe. It could be .com, sorry. And they've kind of been scraping the internet for all of the healthcare-based LCAs. And you can see on some of their graphs that there's been a huge increase in the number of LCAs over the last few years within this space. And they're answering some really fascinating questions. So some of it is around what kind of procedure, therapeutic care pathway should I choose? So, and this is from a clinician perspective, not a patient perspective. But if I, the clinician, have multiple ways of doing something, I might want to consider the environmental impacts of this. So these are some studies ongoing with some colleagues in gastroenterology. So you can think of your colonoscopies for those of you in the older age range. It's coming up on my horizon too. Heiko Pohl is a gastroenterologist in the Eastern US, and he's been doing some really interesting studies because colonoscopy is kind of the standard of care right now, where once we hit a certain age, we're supposed to get a colonoscopy every 10 years. But there are emerging cancer screening techniques that may be better from a variety of perspectives. And one of these is this FIT test. And I apologize, I cannot remember what FIT stands for. It's definitely an acronym. Maybe it's on the page somewhere. But in essence, the FIT test is where you would send in a sample from your home once a year, and they would screen that sample for colon cancer indicators. And if it came up positive, then you would go in for a colonoscopy. But it eliminates the need for regular colonoscopies every 10 years. And so the question then became, which one is more environmentally preferred if we're developing national policies for screening for cancer? And answering these kinds of questions is really fascinating because it has policy implications. And you do have to integrate outcomes, of course, into your LCA modeling because there are errors in both of these tests. And so it's kind of fun to work in these spaces. Another example here is for radiation oncology, where again, there are new treatment approaches. So someone receiving cancer treatment could go through what's called hypofractionation, which essentially means that you're getting a higher dose every visit, so you have fewer visits. And what we found in this study was that the fewer visits really reduces the carbon footprint from cancer treatment because you're not traveling to the clinic constantly. It could be as many as 40 visits reduced down to 20, for example. And so those are all great approaches or great applications of life cycle assessment that help us make clinical decisions and set kind of larger, broader policies. There are, of course, product comparisons that can be done within the LCA healthcare space, and this would be like any LCA, right? Which product should I be using? Which one's better for the environment? And so we have quite a few of these LCAs emerging, particularly with reusable versus disposable items. But one of the projects that I've been working on with one of my consulting clients, the Association for Medical Device Reprocessors, is really diving into single-use device reprocessing. So there is a market, for those of you unfamiliar with healthcare. A lot of our supplies are single-use and disposable, but there is an emerging market that's got FDA-approved clearance to take certain single-use devices, clean them, disinfect them, test them, and then sell them back to hospitals. So you get a little bit of reusability with these single-use products. It's a little microcircularity kind of thing going on. You can't reuse those things indefinitely. Usually there's 1 to maybe 7 cycles per instrument, depending on what that instrument is. And these can range from pulse oximeters, like the little things that they clamp onto your finger to check if your heart's beating and how much oxygen you have in your blood flow, to tubing and like cautery devices that are used in surgeries. So wide range of products. There's over 300 that are FDA approved. And we've known for a long time that they're cost effective, right? It's very clear from the economics that hospitals can save 25 to 50% on the purchase price per item. But we weren't really sure about the environmental implications of this. And I had been pushing various players in this industry for a long time to do an LCA. We know it reduces waste, but we weren't sure if the processes by which we're cleaning and disinfecting these things would be less than the original manufacturing processes. And there had, in the last couple of years, been a large emergence of these LCAs of reprocessed single-use devices, and they all found reductions in the carbon footprint. Most of them were carbon emissions focused. And so this was really exciting kind of validation that those reprocessed devices do in fact reduce your carbon emissions if you're buying them back from sending them to these third-party reprocessors, that you can reduce your carbon footprint per device by 1/3 to almost half. And that's something, right? It gives healthcare systems at least an easy approach to sustainability because they don't have to change the way that they're purchasing or storing items. Other ways of using LCA would be to develop best practices, right? So what policies or initiatives should my institution, should I engage in that will encourage sustainability in my organization? So some of my earlier work as a graduate student, like 10, 15 years ago already, was looking at laparoscopic hysterectomy, so the removal of a woman's uterus. And there was kind of like roughly 4 different ways to do it, meaning like approaches to the procedure. And we took some of that data and then we did some modeling exercises, basically saying if we modified the inputs here to whatever ranges were possible, what would the emissions then look like? And so for laparoscopic hysterectomy, we got together a group of obstetricians, gynecologists, and said, when you're doing this surgery, what's the bare minimum supplies that you would need to do it effectively, right, safely? And given that instrument list that they provided us, we estimated that they could reduce their carbon emissions almost half if they just stopped bringing so much stuff into the procedures. And this was supported by our observational studies or data collection for the LCA, where we did find a lot of unused, unopened items in these procedures. And so this is kind of a little more extreme than just getting rid of unused items, but saying what items do you really not need to use? But half of their carbon footprint could be reduced just by not bringing in these single-use supplies. Reprocessing of single-use devices, we estimated about a 10% savings per procedure. And then you can see anesthesia here. I'll come back to anesthesia a little bit later, there's a little bit of controversy around this, but they were at the time using a type of anesthetic gas that is a pretty potent greenhouse gas called desflurane. And if they drop the use of desflurane entirely, we estimated they could reduce their emissions by about 1/3. And you can see recycling over here would do very little. I'm sure those of you who've done a lot of work in the space are not surprised, but basically if they recycled absolutely everything they possibly could, there wouldn't be that much savings. And partially that's because there's not a lot of recycled content use within healthcare. That if they're not using that recycled content, it's not clear it's actually being recycled and offsetting the use of virgin plastics. And this followed pretty perfectly the reduce, reuse, recycle kind of mantra, right? And so this is what we've been telling healthcare systems for a long time. Start with reduction. Don't bring it in if you don't need it. And recycling is probably the last thing you should consider if you're really looking at carbon emissions reductions. I like to also highlight rethink because we know that there are lots of different ways of doing these procedures if you look broadly, if you look around the world. And you can still have really effective clinical outcomes and still be using the same equipment, but achieve really amazing savings. And so that's another one I like to kind of bring up with folks. This was another example of a life cycle assessment looking at interventional radiology. So interventional radiology is a lot of port placements within bodies. So it's basically surgery, but they're using radiology equipment like CTs or X-rays during the procedure to make sure that they're placing things properly within a person's body. And it's a lot of drainage ports and things like that. And so we had gone in and collected data over a week-long time period. So they're doing lots of different interventional radiology procedures during that time. And we looked at all the different things that, of course, were needed for those procedures. And you can see the total emissions for the week. A large part of it is coming from the HVAC, the HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning for the space. The next largest category here is the production of those single-use supplies. Now, HVAC was interesting because the hash line here represents the time when the operating rooms were actually not in use. So about half of the HVAC related emissions were coming from off hours HVAC use. Basically what happens in a lot of these ORs is that they're not needed for emergent cases, right? This operating room only worked like 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. And they didn't have patients in there overnight or on weekends, but they still ran the ORs as if they were operating with patients. So this was a major finding of like, just turn off the lights, turn down the air changes per hour. So you're not ventilating so much air, so you're not conditioning so much air for these spaces. Operating rooms have really high airflow rates as required by code, but code also says that when you're not using them, you can reduce them down to like normal room kind of ventilation rates, and you don't have to have them with such tight humidity and temperature controls. And so this was kind of supporting that that part of the code, saying we can do better here, we can reduce what we're using, and it will actually have quite a few savings. Other things we've been able to do in other spaces, I've worked a lot in ophthalmology, looking particularly at cataract surgeries. And from all the studies in cataract surgeries, and also kind of building on those studies from hysterectomy, we can develop some guides. So here's kind of a decision tree that we developed for ophthalmologists, though it applies to any surgeon, where we start with supplies here and we say, do you need to use it? If you need to use it, great, that's fine. Does it have to be single use and disposable? Some of them do. So yes, do we use all of those items or are they sized appropriately? And for this question, are they sized appropriately? It might be like I have OR towels that I need to kind of dry off a person's face as I'm operating on them. Do I need 10 of them in my procedure or do I need only 2? Because these things come in packs that are organized kind of beforehand to make it easier for people to stock the room during a procedure. And those packs are not always assessed regularly. So there might be excessive things in those packs. And so a surgeon could go through this guide and say, actually, we don't need all that stuff. And so then they might come down here and say, yeah, how much can we remove? And can I do it myself? Great, I'll get rid of it. Or maybe I need to build consensus. And so these decision trees, I hope, have been helpful. We've got a pretty engaged group of ophthalmologists working on sustainability. I always like to point to the UIE Sustain website where they're doing a lot of work, very detailed kind of work, getting into like this particular drug, how can we reformulate it? Or how can we get rid of paper instructions for use in all of our cataract implants? So lots of cool things happening in this space that are enabled by life cycle assessments, right? You see there's no environmental data on this, but it's a decision tree based on the environmental data that we've been able to provide through life cycle assessment. So the other message that we're really trying to push within healthcare is that this environmental data really complements existing quality improvement programs. I often say that US healthcare is bloated. We just use way too much stuff. We don't need to use that much stuff. A lot of it we don't even use at all. We just throw it away constantly. So it's pretty ridiculous. And when it comes to quality improvement programs, I think the environmental issues kind of fit nicely with these. Some of this is like choosing wisely and get it right first time. Those often are actually getting up higher than what materials you're bringing into a procedure, but just asking, is the procedure necessary at all? Because there is, unfortunately, still a lot of misuse in medicine and overuse. And there's reasons for that, but we're really trying to get to these root causes and reduce the need for medical care. And that's kind of a public health issue, but as patients are being assessed, it's kind of the question of what's the lowest resource intervention that we can apply to this person that's practical for them and their needs. And it does fit nicely with a lot of these other programs that already exist. So there are some questions the LCA can only kind of answer in the healthcare space. And this is important, I think, too. LCA exists kind of at all these different levels, right? So we have kind of the global supply chain and national health sectors. We have individual health systems. And particularly for the US, the national health sector and the health systems are differentiated. In a place like the UK, these might be the same, right? But in the US, we have a lot of different health systems. I'm part of NYU Langone Health, which operates mostly in the Eastern US, though we have a location in Florida for some reason. But you can think of like there's Mayo, Kaiser Permanente, Cleveland Clinics, Aurora, like all these different health systems across the US, and they each are pretty independent in the US. Many other countries have nationalized health services, which is a different thing altogether. Within a health system, then you have those buildings that we're all pretty familiar with, like a hospital, tertiary care center, clinics, those kinds of things. And within the clinics, then you have these care pathways that I was just mentioning. So what kinds of treatments are we providing? What kind of diagnostics are we providing? And then when you go even deeper, then you get into what are all the supplies needed for that care pathway, right? So we have a lot of different layers within the health space. And this is kind of what I was mentioning. Each health system nationally has different footprint. And that means we can see kind of hotspots, right? The US stands out, Australia stands out. Partially that's our electric grids compared to these other countries. And maybe also sizing or the health of our general population. When we look even deeper, right, we can break these down into what are those individual health systems made up out of. You can see hospitals are a major part of it, and pharmaceuticals are another large part. And so those might be target areas, right? This is another area where you can identify hotspots. This is a high level or top-down kind of assessment of the US healthcare system, and it employs the greenhouse gas scoping protocols. So this is looking at for a specific hospital or healthcare system, where are some of those emissions coming from? Actually, this is the US national, but you could look at it as like a health system. Scopes 1 and 2, as you can see, the direct emissions are pretty small, and unsurprisingly, scope 3 is quite large. It's a service industry, so that makes sense. What can healthcare providers do? What can health administrators do? What can product manufacturers do, right? There's a bunch of players and stakeholders in this system, and we have to think about it from all angles to be able to tackle this effectively. I think the healthcare providers have been really engaged, and they're starting to get healthcare administrators engaged. Manufacturers are starting to come around to it because providers are asking for it. And governments, well, the US government is kind of an interesting beast, but they're trying to get involved in the ways that they can. But these hotspots really help us. For hospital level assessments, the greenhouse gas reporting protocol is pretty effective. LCA really, I think, fails us in these in-between grounds, right? We have the IO models for the national level kind of assessment, and we can kind of use the IO models for a health system level assessment. We can use from the bottom up for supplies and procedures, we can use that process-based LCA, but it's that middle ground that we're really struggling with. So how do we report emissions for a hospital or even a health system? It's a little too big to tackle through process-based LCA, but we don't get enough nuance with the IO models to be able to make really clear directives. It helps, it can point to it, but it's not quite as accurate as we'd like. So let me go to the next slide here. What hospitals are really looking for as they're engaging in this space is performance monitoring. And the IO models are really challenging for that. Healthcare markets, in terms of the financials, are not reliable, I'd say. And I always love to point to the pharmaceutical sector for this. I can buy my drugs here in the US, or I can go to Canada and buy them for a whole lot less. Does that mean that the Canadian drugs have a lower carbon footprint? Our models would say yes, but I don't believe that's true. And so it's a little bit of a struggle to figure out, with the pricing the way it is in the healthcare space, if IO models are going to be an effective way to monitor performance of health systems as they engage in this space. So here you can see purchased goods. This is a single healthcare system example. The purchased goods are like 41% of total emissions. Investments for this particular one are also quite high. Healthcare systems usually have quite a few investments. And scope 1 and 2, it's definitely more manageable that we can measure these things more immediately. Scope 1 often includes anesthetic gases, the nitrous oxide, things like that, and then purchased electricity. Those are relatively easy to monitor over time. But this scope 3 emissions space is a real challenge for us right now, and we're trying to figure out the best way to do it. Again, we're defaulting to IO-based models, but I have some substantial concerns about using that. Now, as you can imagine, LCA has been introduced into the space and we're starting to make changes, but with change comes pushback. And some of these are justified and some of them are maybe less so, but we have some controversies emerging in the space, which has been quite fun to see. One, as with every LCA, it depends. And so I have some concerns about people who are using these LCAs to make clinical practice decisions if they're not really sure how an LCA works. As a consultant, I've definitely had doctors come up to me and be like, can you just do a really quick LCA, like do in 5 minutes or something? I'm like, that's not how an LCA works. But getting into the nuance of an LCA isn't always in alignment with the way that physicians are consuming information, right? This is one really nice example from Forbes McGinn in Australia, where he looked at a comparison of reusable and single-use central venous catheter insertion kits, so an IV kit, basically. And what they found was that for Australia, the disposable IV kits were better from a greenhouse gas emissions profile. But in Europe and North America, the reusable was preferred. And that had to do with the way that water was being heated to wash the reusable kits in Australia. Sweden did a follow-up, his group from Sweden did a follow-up on this and just kind of highlighted that for them, where their electric grid is so clean, the reusables were clearly winners every time. And they even got into more of the textiles being reusable and showing that if everything's reusable, you can really reduce your carbon profile. This is compared to McGain's study on the right here. The other thing that comes up a lot in this space, certainly when I'm writing for grants to the National Institutes of Health, I get this all the time, like, who cares? It's only 5% of global emissions. So I've been trying to tell them more and more, that's more than aviation. And we're flight shaming people all the time. Like, let's talk about this too small to matter issue. Anesthetic gases have been kind of an interesting one here, where there are a bunch of fluorine type gases that are used to knock people out before a procedure. But you can also do an injectable called propofol, which, yes, is how Michael Jackson died. In hospitals, it's much better managed and you're really unlikely to die. Anyway, sevoflurane and desflurane are typically used in combination with nitrous oxide. Nitrous, you'll probably be familiar with as a greenhouse gas. But sevoflurane is about 130 times as potent as CO2 on a 100-year time scale. Nitrous is about 310, depends on how you're measuring it, but roughly that. And desflurane is 2,500 times more potent. So just given these numbers, it became very clear that desflurane should be gotten rid of. And from the anesthesiologists who were working on this problem, it was also a no-brainer because desflurane was more expensive and not as great clinically speaking. There were alternatives that were perfectly functional and would work for any patient. So there was no need, clinically speaking, to keep desflurane. Propofol is great. It's not a greenhouse gas. So you obviously have some emissions associated with manufacturing it and administering it, but it doesn't inherently create emissions. So those earlier hysterectomy studies that I mentioned, this was the profile of greenhouse gas emissions from the anesthetic gas usage. Where up top there, we have the desflurane, and an order of magnitude lower is sevoflurane, and like 3 orders of magnitude lower than that is the propofol. So pretty clear and drastic reductions in greenhouse gases if you stop using desflurane. And you can see these little blue triangles here are sevoflurane used with nitrous. So if we kind of eliminated nitrous use, if possible, that could also help reduce these emissions as well. These kinds of studies led to many health systems and even like national health systems banning the use of desflurane. Like they're just not going to buy it anymore. And that's fine. It worked out well. But recently, there was a paper published from a climate scientist who basically said that desflurane doesn't pollute that much and that carbon dioxide hangs out longer in the atmosphere. Therefore, we shouldn't really do a whole lot about desflurane. And the paper has hit people a little bit weird, where, of course, many people got really upset about this because we've invested a bit of time and effort into getting rid of desflurane from our clinical spaces. And, you know, it's kind of a foothold for broader climate work. And so, you know, to their chief complaint that this isn't that much of greenhouse gases, yeah, we know. And we also know that healthcare's emissions of these things is pretty small. So this is not a two-scale pie chart. In that I'm not sure how much desflurane actually contributes to the whole part of the pie. But if global greenhouse gas emissions from healthcare are about 5%, 4.5%, then of that, how much is desflurane? It's going to be really tiny. And we know that that's okay. The original study that highlighted the issues with these fluorinated gases actually said global desflurane use is probably equivalent to 1 or 2 coal-fired power plants. So we know it's small relative to all those emissions. And the question for me really on this, is it too small, was what am I better able to influence here? If I'm a clinician, I'm not going to be able to close down a coal-fired power plant as easily as I will be able to not use desflurane, right? And so the amount of action that the overhead for the action is a lot easier for healthcare professionals to tackle desflurane than it is to close down 1 to 2 coal-fired power plants, right? And so it's something they can do, and it does contribute. So it's doing something, right? The other thing here, that CO2 lasts longer and it's better mixed vertically in the atmosphere is absolutely true. Desflurane lasts kind of on the edge of being a meaningful greenhouse gas, I guess you could say, in that we think it lasts in the atmosphere in this form for about 14 years. It doesn't really break down into other GHGs the way like methane breaks down into carbon dioxide anyway. So this does suggest that, yeah, CO2 is a much bigger thing to tackle than just desflurane itself. So it contributes to short-term global warming, not so much to long-term global warming. And you may care about one of those things more than the other. Carbon dioxide lasts a lot longer, it's more prevalent, and the additional emissions have a larger cumulative effect. So all that said, the way that I'm interpreting these types of controversies that are emerging is that desflurane reduction or elimination alone won't do much to stop global warming. And that's true of any climate action that we take. You know, whatever one thing we as individuals or institutions or organizations do probably doesn't matter a whole lot, but we need all of those small actions to contribute to that overarching reduction. We also need to eliminate or reduce sources of nitrous and carbon dioxide within healthcare systems. And I think the deep dive into anesthetic gases has revealed a few other things for us in the healthcare space that we didn't know about before. So people have started doing studies of nitrous use in hospitals. So laughing gas, you know, is commonly used for a lot of different treatment purposes with questionable effectiveness. And a lot of hospitals put in manifold piping, like piping systems, to get nitrous to these different clinical spaces. And what they're finding now that they're looking at these problems is that the use of nitrous in healthcare, most of it is actually being leaked out in the walls. The studies that have emerged show that 99% of the nitrous hospitals purchase does not end up in a patient, but it's gone. So that's problematic in a lot of different ways, but I don't think we would have looked into nitrous if we hadn't started with desflurane. And we know supply chains are full of carbon dioxide and other long-term greenhouse gas emissions. And so desflurane is kind of a foothold for getting people interested in those things. I hate recycling of plastics, but if it gets people to do it, to get engaged in sustainability, I say go for it. But you know, like recycling, desflurane should also not be the only thing that your health system's engaged in. So those are my takeaways. You can't just do one thing and call it good. So that's one controversy. Here's a bit that I hope will be really helpful for you all. We're seeing a lot of limitations of LCA as we're applying it to this healthcare space. And one, I would love to address the data gaps here. So hopefully some of you are excited about this too and can get a move on it. But I think there's also methodological improvements we can work on. So for data gaps, the big one are drugs for us. We have like no information on process-based information on pharmaceutical manufacturing. There are some studies emerging that are trying to point towards this to give us some information, but the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry, as you can imagine, has not been very forthcoming with information on this. I know they're engaged in sustainability actions, but the public-facing side of that is not there, and there's not a lot of data. So every time I'm looking at procedures and I have drugs, I have to find a workaround, whether it's using a generic organic chemical in EcoInvent or switching over to an IO model for those particular drugs. None of them are great solutions, and we need to have more information there. Two, not just the manufacturing of drugs, but the downstream emissions of drugs are particularly concerning to me. We, just as an example, so my uncle recently passed away from kidney cancer. And when he was in treatment last year, we went to visit him, and his wife was told to wear gloves and to double flush their toilet when handling his urine because it was radioactive and toxic. That's fine. That's what happens with cancer treatment these days. But they live in a small rural area, and that water that flushes down the toilet doesn't go away, right? They live on a septic system. It's in their backyard now. And it wouldn't even matter if they were going through a wastewater treatment plant because most wastewater treatment plants can't handle that kind of waste. Pharmaceutical ingredients end up in our surface water all the time. I do a lot of work in radiology, and they're getting concerned about some of these contrast agents that they're injecting into patients to do certain scans. So they inject a human form of gadolinium and iodinated contrast. The gadolinium they find in all surface waters where there's an MR present. It's just in our environment now. And we don't know what it means for our bodies to be exposed to this human-made gadolinium because it's not an element we're usually exposed to. And so this, you can imagine the vast array of pharmaceuticals that are being used and disposed and ending up in our surface waters and soils and whatnot. And we don't know what it does to our health, but I can't imagine it's great. So there's all kinds of issues on this front. And LCA, of course, does not include any of these things because it doesn't even include the manufacturing of these items. So we have a lot of work to do with like use talks and other groups to figure out what does it mean when we have these different pharmaceutical ingredients out there in the environment, exposed to UV and other chemicals and things. This is a huge, huge space that needs a lot of work. And the last thing that has been interesting to explore with healthcare professionals who are engaged in this space is really plastics. And I know we have Mary LCA and some other groups that are trying to work on getting more of those downstream impacts of plastics into our LCA methodology. But I think this is especially important for the healthcare space because right now plastics are kind of almost like given a pass, right? The true emissions impact for plastics is not well represented in LCA. And for healthcare, we use so many plastics. Plastics are like, I don't know if it's 90% of our waste streams. It's an incredible amount of plastic waste coming out of healthcare. So there's the typical like microplastics pollution. There's a lot of studies now showing that microplastics are showing up inside humans. I saw one at a conference recently that was a little disturbing where like patients who have microplastics visible in a blockage in their arteries are like 4 times more likely to have a heart attack than people who don't have visible microplastics. So we know microplastics alone are impacting our health, but then we have things like endocrine disruption. And endocrine disruption in the sustainable healthcare space has been kind of a separate issue where we're very concerned about endocrine exposure for like NICU babies, right? These premature babies who are just covered, literally covered inside and out in plastic. And we know that IV bags and IV tubing can leach those endocrine disrupting chemicals directly into our patients. And so these are things that are just not well accounted for in the LCA space and would be very fascinating to kind of update the things that we have. One last little bit here is more about medical grade products. Like, does medical grade stainless steel, is it different from regular stainless steel or medical grade plastics? Right now, most of us are using EcoInvent generic unit processes, so we don't know. And this is just an ongoing question. We don't know if it matters, but it might. Scaling and monitoring in Europe, we know that there is a lot more carbon accounting coming for green claims rules, and actually large organizations are required now to do their carbon accounting, and that includes hospitals in Europe. In the UK, they have a sustainable procurement policy, which requires essentially an LCA for every product the NHS wants to buy. And in the US, we have some White House pledges that hospitals have been signing on to. About 15% of US hospitals have now said that they will actively reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and that they will quantify their scope 3 emissions by last year. I don't know how many of them have done it. It's voluntary, but there's 15% of US hospitals that have signed on. And there is a procurement policy through an executive order. I don't know if it's cleared yet legally, but looking for disclosure, and for federal procurement contracts like the VA health system, those suppliers would have to disclose their carbon emissions. So we're seeing a huge growth in the use of LCA, but does everyone need to do a scope 3 assessment? How will everyone do their LCAs, right? We as in every industry, need to find a way to do them faster and cheaper, but still accurately. I've heard from companies like, let's say 3M, where they have over 10,000 products. They can't do an LCA of every single product. So what's the best way to get these kinds of data where they need to go? Is interpretation going to be okay in this space? And I'd say, yeah, there's always going to be mistakes. And so how do we start building up people's ability to interpret these things? And with those scope 3 financial based models, can we build them something better where they can actually monitor their emissions over time and actively reduce them without being sidetracked by the fact that the higher price means a higher carbon footprint in our models? So LCA is still powerful. It's been around for a while. It's used in a lot of industry. It's a model, but it gives us quantitative data. It's being updated and re-innovated all the time. And focusing just on one thing within the healthcare space is maybe not the most important thing, but it's something we know about now. And the more that we dig into this, the more we'll discover. So that's my conclusion. I'd love to hear questions and get some thoughts on this all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thiel. And now our Director of Research, Nathan Ayer, will ask the questions of our audience to you.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Cassie. That was such a great overview of such a huge area of ongoing, emerging work. And the questions are rolling in now because you touched on so many interesting things, and you obviously didn't have time to go deep on most of them. The first question I have that two people have kind of referred to is related to the obvious focus on greenhouse gas emissions. So one question was, can you share a reference to a good study that does more than greenhouse gas emissions in healthcare, because we don't see that many of them?
Yeah.
And related to that, are there particular impact assessment methods or categories that you feel we should be including on top of greenhouse gas emissions?
Great questions, and a little bit challenging to answer. So I'd say the LCA case studies where there's more than just greenhouse gases, there are quite a few out there. And oftentimes what I'll do when I'm publishing a study is the manuscript itself will just have the greenhouse gases, because I don't want to overwhelm medical readers who it may be their first time thinking about greenhouse gases. And I'll use the supplemental information files to list all the other emissions. And so I try to include the full LCA. It just may not be in the main manuscript, which I don't know, it's there, but you have to dig for it, which isn't the best. We have had other studies where we've highlighted a few other impact categories. So I think air pollution or air quality kind of is one of those natural fits in the healthcare space, because it's a direct human health impact, right? So if I say we're emitting however many parts per million of PM10, that has a direct connection to our patient health. And so that's something that a lot of clinicians can get behind. The first study I had really done was that hysterectomy study, and there we report everything. I think we published it in the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment, if I remember correctly. And there we have all the emissions categories. But what was interesting in talking to our clinical teams at that point was that they hated the human health categories. Like the doctors were all like, human health cancer, what kind of cancer? And like, how bad is it? And how aggressive is it? And like, it's just too broad for them. And you can see it even in the error bars. Like if you do a Monte Carlo on those things, it's massive error bars. So those impact categories, I kind of have grain of salt type feelings for. But different areas have requested, different geographies that I work in have requested different information. So like the groups in California were very concerned about water consumption, right? And so it may be that depending on which health systems you're looking at, they might be interested in other issues. The universally engaging environmental topic has been climate change, and so that's kind of the dominating factor. But people are open to other things like air quality and water consumption or water quality.
Yeah, great. Thank you. There was a question about what you would say are the main data gaps. You touched on a few key data gaps there. Would you want to add anything further to that discussion?
Yeah, I think so. I work primarily with like EcoInvent and SEMA Pro, sometimes Open LCA, but in the EcoInvent database, there are, I think the major data gap is really pharmaceuticals and that chemical side of things, that we just don't have unit processes for a lot of the chemicals and pharmaceuticals that are being used in this space. So that's a huge data gap. The other one that I touched on, which I'm not sure how important it is like medical grade stuff. Like if there's a lot of stainless steel instruments or like any type of plastic, like it's technically a medical grade, and I don't know if that means that there's more waste associated with it, or like how that changes the manufacturing process and the resulting emissions. I'm not sure. So that may be somewhat of a red herring. It may not matter. And certainly depending on how detailed your LCA is, it may not matter at all, right? And so right now we're just using generic materials. We've certainly found other materials where we can't really find quite the right one, but it's fine. Like sometimes the gloves we just model generically as like synthetic rubber instead of whatever hyper detailed kind of synthetic rubber it is. And it's okay for like procedure level stuff. The gloves are a small portion, and you can kind of get a general idea of where those emissions are coming from. But the main data gap is definitely pharmaceuticals. We know so little about them.
Right. And I guess related to that, what is the main barrier? Is it confidentiality and competition in that industry that they're reluctant to share data? Like who do you see as the one or two of the key players who might help to resolve that gap?
Yeah, I've been chatting with a few academics about this. I think on the manufacturing side, well, I think the whole industry is a little bit shrouded in secrecy, and they're allowed to do a lot of things. I mean, if you look at like the opioid crisis here in the US, you can see that despite complaints about heavy regulation, it's not as well regulated as you would hope, and there's a lot of weird things happening in that space. And so I suspect that the companies have a really large part to play in why we don't have a lot of data from that sector. But I also think it's a sector that people hadn't paid attention to before, right? Like we were really focused in LCA development on like retail spaces and green buildings and all these other industries where there were kind of clear, more logical carbon implications, right? Transportation, we know we're burning a bunch of fuel. And we had some like petrochemical development, right? But we didn't really look at the pharmaceutical development. And it may have been because, like with healthcare, we said, well, that's a critical industry, and we want access to pharmaceuticals without hindering their development, right? So for a long time, we didn't look at healthcare because it was like, well, they're providing essential services. Why would they need to change what they're doing? And now that we've shifted the lens over to them, we see, oh man, there's a lot of things that they could improve, and it would improve their costs as well. Like this is mutually beneficial all around to work on sustainability in the space. And it's not going to impact the quality of care we provide for our patients. It's actually going to improve it, if anything. And so I think for a long time we were ignoring those medical type industries because we viewed them as kind of sacred or special. And now we're finding that, oh, we should actually probably be paying attention.
Great, thanks. Now, a question around waste management, end of life issues. You mentioned you have some mixed feelings about recycling. So there was a question of what is the alternative to recycling in healthcare, and is it not mostly incineration? And because of that, shouldn't recycling or downcycling be strongly considered for healthcare?
Yeah, I have a lot of how would I word this? So I think the end of life stuff in healthcare is really challenging. Um, so in US hospitals, incineration is actually rarely used these days. That's not true in Europe. Europe still uses a lot of incineration for their medical waste, but in the US, we've shifted away from medical waste incineration because of dioxin concerns. Because it used to be every hospital had their own incinerator. It wasn't like it was going to a central facility. So you can imagine that was not awesome for their patient population. Especially as they shifted towards more single-use disposable plastics. And so anyway, we've moved away from incineration. We're now, unless the local municipality is incinerating, most hospitals only incinerate chemopathogenic waste, so stuff that's touched a chemo patient, or recognizable body parts. You don't want that in a landfill. So anyway, most of the other stuff will end up either in a landfill or autoclave and shredded before going to a landfill. And I think there's lots of potential for recycling, but what often happens for healthcare professionals is they're like, oh, we're recycling, we're green. And there's no assurance that the stuff they're sending to a recycling facility is actually being recycled or downcycled or whatever. It may just still end up in Indonesia somewhere being burned in an open pit, which is way worse than just having incinerated locally or in our case, landfilling it locally. And there's just not a lot of circularity yet in the healthcare space. I think that's one of those hot topics right now, is figuring out how we can increase the circularity for things like single-use devices. There's an over-reliance on single-use devices. We don't need to have disposable everything like we do in healthcare. And we see that is true from studying other countries where they can't afford to be single-use everything, and they're still able to provide really high quality, safe care with reusables, and we used to do it in the past as well. Looking at past records is a little hard because we didn't have antibiotics the same way we do today. But anyway, all these complications aside, if we can increase circularity, if we can assure that those recycled things are ending up in recycled content somewhere, I'm okay with it. But I don't think that's what most people do when they engage in recycling. They put up a bin, they throw stuff in it, and they're like, we're good.
Great, thanks. There's one participant had two related questions that I think are about drivers coming down from government directive and how they might affect this space. So this is particularly in the European context. So the person notes that the European Union has proposed the Safe and Sustainable by Design framework recently. How might that impact the development of new products and processes in the healthcare sector? And then related to that, they also note the European Union's aiming to create a digital product passport for products sold or used in the EU with life cycle based accounting. And do you see that as having an influence on where things go?
I do. So I can't speak much to the safe and sustainable by design. Like I don't know their criteria there, but it sounds like it would be awesome. Like just from the title and what I can imagine it would be. The work that I do with medical device manufacturers is really to try to push them more to that design phase. Like you have to think about all these different sustainability criteria, whether it's circularity or whatever, up front. It can't just be after you've already had your product and you're selling it to people that you start thinking like, oh, how can we do product take back programs or something like that. And so I think, pushing things into the design phase is really important for this space. And thinking across the life cycle is still not something that a lot of facilities do. For the digital product passport, we're seeing that emerge. I've already worked with companies that are using those for capital equipment, so like MRs and CTs and things like that. And it is very helpful in the same way that environmental product declarations are helpful. I think that's probably a better solution than having everyone do a full LCA of every single product. Because it does refine your scope and your criteria a little bit more to say like, these are the things you are including, these are the things you're not including. But we do have to be careful to make sure that that standardization is very clear and evenly applied, because people will make purchasing decisions based off of those product passports. And so if they're not evenly fair, then that can get weird. Just as an example, like we bought a new washer dryer unit, and it has different energy consumption numbers on the top because it can be sold in the US and Canada, and apparently it's less energy efficient in Canada. Really annoying.
Great. We'll try to get a couple more in here. There's a comment and a question here on the topic you covered on anesthetic gases. This person says the main concern with avoiding desflurane is burden shifting to long-lived GHG, particularly CO2. Propofol anesthesia potentially creates an increased need for single-use disposables, which have inherent life cycle CO2 emissions. So decreasing short-lived GHG emissions by inadvertently increasing long-lived GHGs may be detrimental. Do you have any thoughts on that aspect?
Yeah, I don't think that it does that. Just from the use phase part of this. And I'll say a few reasons why. Well, I don't know if this will work for propofol, but basically if we move away from desflurane, right, you still have a lot of single-use disposables that are used for administering desflurane and other anesthetic gases. You've got the tubing and the mouthpiece and all these things. Some of that could be reusable in whatever institution you're in, but a lot of them are all just disposable everything. And that's a larger chunk of plastic and tubing that's used for the breathing apparatus than it is for an IV. You might still have oxygen or some other tubing, so I'm not sure if it entirely replaces it, but you may probably already still have an IV in you whether you're getting propofol or not. And so you need the IV starter kit and like some of the stuff that the propofol would come in. But I think in terms of switching between propofol and desflurane, I feel my intuition from observing all these things is that there's actually more plastics use in administering desflurane than there is in administering propofol. That in total, your waste generation is higher with desflurane if you're completely switching over to propofol use. And there are other programs that are looking at getting away from anesthetic use or sedative use in general. I've worked with hand surgeons that are piloting what they call wide awake surgeries. So they block your arm, they inject something that just makes you numb instead of knocking you out. And this has huge benefits all around if the patient's tolerant to it, right? Not everyone wants to be awake for their hand surgery. But basically, the patient doesn't have to come in for as much preoperative testing, right? They do a lot of heart checks and things on you if you're going in for a general anesthetic or a sedative, because they want to make sure you're going to survive it. But if you're just doing a block in the arm, that's fine. You don't really need as much testing beforehand. So you can save journeys, you can save visits and all the plastics that are involved in that. The patient is awake, which is safer for the patient. They can drive themselves into the procedure, though it's a hand surgery, so I don't know how that works. But you don't need to have someone driving you because you've been under the influence of certain drugs. During the surgery, the surgeon can actually ask you to manipulate your hand so they can tell that it actually worked. So there's a lot of really cool things emerging there in like just trying to shift away from these anesthetic gases and sedatives and things. But yeah, I think you're right that burden shifting is an important consideration. I don't think it applies to this particular example, just given the observations that I've made. Like I don't have the data to support that claim, but observationally, I don't think it holds.
Okay, great. So I'll make this the last quick question. I'm looking at the time. You referenced towards the end your concerns around the release of toxins and pharmaceuticals into the natural environment and through to human and ecosystem exposure. Just in terms of options at the hospital level, are there any particular available technologies or approaches that can deal with that are in use or that are being proposed that we could also consider from an LCA perspective?
I think that's an interesting one. I know that on the radiology side, I know that some companies that manufacture like the anthropogenic gadolinium are trialing products that can basically harvest the gad. And I think they could harvest it to the point where they could reuse it in veterinary care or something like that. They don't usually use those things in humans for reasons, but basically they are trying to figure out ways to do capturing but it depends on what the item is, right? So for gadolinium, it's usually excreted from the body, like most of it's excreted within like 72 hours or some short time frame after it's been injected. But that's not true for every pharmaceutical, right? It may take longer for it to come out. And then the harvesting techniques may be different, depending on how diluted it is and all those kinds of things. So I think people are starting to play around with it, but it's not as well developed as like anesthetic gas capturing systems. So that the waste anesthetic gas capturing systems may be one of those burden shifting kind of issues. But anyway, that's like a totally different topic.
Good. That's a good question and to explore for next time. So we've hit our time. Thank you so much, Cassie, for a wonderful presentation and thoughtful overview of all the big issues. And thank you everyone who attended and submitted questions. And we will be posting the recording in the coming days for those who arrived late or for those who weren't able to make it. So thanks again, Cassie. We appreciate it so
Yes,
much.
thank you all.
Thank you all and have a
I'm trying to answer
wonderful.
one of these other questions.
Yeah, feel maybe type into the chat there. So thanks, and everyone have a great afternoon or evening wherever you may be. And thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.